The rain came as it always did in August, warm, violent, and without warning. But when it hit the rusted gate of the Rose of Mercy Convent, the storm broke around it as if the iron bars had made a pact with the wind. The vines that crept across the stone walls hadn't been trimmed in months. The gravel path beyond was untracked by carriage or boot. Even the mud at the base of the gate seemed dry, untouched by man or horse, and above it all loomed the tower, spindly and black against the darkening sky, with its bell, once the voice of the region, hanging dead and hollow. It had not rung in 72 days. In a parish where the bell marked everything, birth, death, famine, grace, its silence had become more terrifying than any cry. No smoke from the kitchen chimneys, no deliveries from the nearby town, no letters received, no candles ordered. But the sisters were still there, or so it was claimed. Visitors had stopped coming weeks ago, but one returned, soaked to the bone. A young inspector assigned by the bishopric, carrying with him not suspicion but routine. What he found was not routine. The nun who greeted him did not blink. Her face was pale, her hands folded not in welcome but in defense. She kept one foot behind the door and spoke as if she were remembering a script someone else had written. He asked about the bell, about the food, about the children they were said to shelter. She said nothing had changed. Her voice was calm, unbothered, but it echoed oddly behind her. Not into open space, but as though bouncing against something massive and unmoving just out of view. The inspector was not let inside. He was told the convent was in deep silence, a spiritual fast. The gates closed slowly but firmly, and the chains that clanked into place afterward sounded older than the rain. But silence has texture, and this one wasn't clean. At night, townspeople said they heard humming, long, low, and female. Not one voice, but many. Sometimes laughter, then sudden silence, like a hand slapping over a mouth. A hunter who passed by the wall claimed he heard children singing in Latin, then sobbing in French. A trader swore he saw a pale figure lowering buckets into the old stone well even as lightning split the sky and the wind tore at her veil. Yet no one came in, and no one went out. Not even the rats who once thrived in the wheat stores were seen scurrying along the outer wall. The place had become an organism without breath, not dead, not alive. Paused. The inspector filed a report. He mentioned no evidence of wrongdoing, but included a single line that made his superior pause. The bell has not rung, but I am certain it has been touched. He returned the next week with a carpenter and a priest. The gates did not open. No one came to the door. They circled the grounds, calling out. Nothing. They left a note. The next morning the bell tolled once. Not loudly, not fully, just once. A cracked, broken sound, like metal refusing to scream. Inside the tower, unseen by any outside eye, the rope was soaked in something thicker than water. Not blood. Something black, congealed, oily. Something that clung to the hands and resisted soap. A week later, the carpenter went missing. His tools were found on the path leading up to the convent wall, neatly arranged in a straight line. One of them, the hammer, had its handle split clean down the middle, not broken by force but pried apart, as though something had crawled inside and pushed. His wife said he came home quiet the night before, hands trembling, eyes staring out the window all night. He never spoke a word. Just before dawn he walked out barefoot into the rain, muttering something about a girl with a stitched mouth and broken knees. No one followed. They were afraid of what might follow back. The bishop's office grew quiet. No more inspectors were sent. The records were marked in spiritual retreat. No questions were asked. But in the town below, families began to whisper that their children were having dreams. Girls with shaved heads, walls that bled salt, beds that burned from the inside, and always, a bell, ringing, but only inside their skulls. Some mothers moved away, others tied crosses to their gates, but one woman stayed. She had once been a nun at Rose of Mercy before the storm, before the silence, before the change. Her face was hollowed out, her speech often tangled. But she spoke one clear sentence to anyone who asked about the bell. "It does not ring to call the faithful," she said. "It rings when it's fed." No one asked what it was. No one wanted to know. But the bell was not touched again. Not by hand, not by rope. It rang again on its own 40 days later. Just once, a single note, just loud enough to wake the dogs, just sharp enough to shake the windows, just long enough to make the children stop breathing for a moment as if something was listening through them. And that night the rain didn't fall. It hovered, thick, unmoving, like breath pressed to a mouth that dared not open. They said it began as a vow, a holy act of discipline, of sacred wakefulness. One by one, the sisters of Rose of Mercy stopped sleeping. At first it was explained in scriptural terms, passages about vigilance and divine readiness. They told visiting clergy that sleep was for the world-weary, and they had transcended it. But when the candlelight hit their faces, their skin was paper, and their hands never stopped shaking. Eyes blood-rimmed and glassy, fingers twitching even in stillness, they moved through the halls like wind-up dolls running on the last click of the key. They would stand for hours at the altar, heads bowed not in reverence but in strange jerks, like something inside them refused to kneel. Even the youngest among them, Sister Eloise, 17 and once soft-eyed, had begun tearing at her own jaw in silence, her nails blackened from the habit of scratching behind her ears until she bled. No one was allowed to speak of exhaustion. To mention sleep was to invite suspicion, and suspicion came with consequences. The first death came quietly. Sister Claudine, age 39, was found sitting upright in the stone washroom, rosary in hand, spine fractured. Not from a fall, and there was no sign of impact, but from within. Her vertebrae had collapsed inward as if her body had been slowly squeezed from the inside, every disc compacted like wet sand under pressure. Her jaw was clenched so tightly it took hours to break it open, and when they did, her tongue had split into 2 long ridges. The Mother Superior told the others it was divine punishment for wandering thoughts. They were made to pray for forgiveness, not hers, but their own, for having witnessed weakness. After that, they were no longer permitted to sit without cause. Resting postures were forbidden. Sleepwalking was seen as heresy. The iron rings bolted to their chamber walls, when once used for penance chains, were repurposed to keep their bodies upright during the night. If a sister so much as nodded, another would ring a small chime tied to her wrist. Every night was broken into 27 prayer intervals. No one was allowed more than 8 minutes of silence at a time. One sister tried to time her blinks to the rosary. She was found with 2 sewing needles beneath her eyelids forced upward so she'd never close them again. What was driving this ritual was not God, not truly. It was something much older, something that had been whispered about in the early founding days of the convent, when the land was first claimed from the swamp. The original mother, now long buried beneath the floor of the east wing, had spoken of a being between hours, something that could only be known if one walked the boundary between dreaming and waking without ever tipping too far into either. It had no name, or rather it had too many, and to call it out was to be bound to it. So instead the sisters made offerings. Sleep was the first, then heat, then sound. They stripped their chambers of bedding, closed the kitchen hearth, stopped the choir rehearsals. One sense at a time peeled back like skin from bone. Mother Clarisse kept a notebook hidden in her sleeve, not of sins but of slips. She recorded each blink, each yawn, each softening of the eyes. For each slip, a ritual. For each ritual, a cost. One sister who dozed during the third watch was ordered to spend the night buried in salt, her eyes open to the sky. When she was dug up, her skin was pale blue, lips dry and cracked. She never spoke again. Not out of shock. Her vocal cords had stiffened into ridged strings like waxed twine. But the most disturbing change wasn't physical. It was how they began to speak of time. The hours no longer mattered. Days had no sequence. They prayed not in accordance with the sun, but with the bell inside the chapel, a bell that rang at erratic intervals now, unconnected to any human hand. They said it told them when to begin again. They called it the throat of the veil. When asked who controlled the bell, they said no one did. It rang when it was hungry, and when it rang, someone always bled. One sister began to hear voices behind the altar curtain, soft voices that whispered in reverse. She was told to fast for clarity. On the fifth night, she was found in the chapel basement, having carved a full transcript of the voices onto the soles of her feet using a nail dipped in bone ash. She died from infection, but not before whispering, "He sees through our sleeplessness." It wasn't madness, not to them. It was communion. Those who lasted longer began to change in quieter ways. They no longer remembered names. They avoided mirrors. They walked in perfect circles while chanting fragments of prayers in languages no one recognized. Their faces became unreadable, as though their expressions had been burned away and replaced with painted serenity. Even Mother Clarisse, who once kept order with cold calculation, began speaking in riddles, asking the sisters if they had combed the dark between their thoughts. She believed, or perhaps knew, that something was watching, that by denying the body its most human need, they were becoming something else. And she wanted that transformation complete. Sleep was the last tether to self. Breaking it meant freedom, or possession. And so they kept going, kept denying, kept twitching, kept trembling, kept bleeding quietly in the corners of their rooms. And the bell rang again, not once but 3 times. Once for the sister who drowned in her own blood during night prayer. Once for the girl who walked into the well with stones in her dress. And once for the carpenter's wife, who slit her throat while sleepwalking, whispering the names of nuns no one had heard of in decades. Each toll marked a moment of devotion, a chapter of decay. And still not one sister slept, not out of strength, but out of fear that what waited in their dreams would follow them back into waking. And it would not come alone. When Dr. Vincent Thorne arrived at Rose of Mercy, he was not looking for death. He was looking for patterns, A slow fever had gripped the surrounding parish, strange in its selectivity. Only young women affected, always after dusk, with no signs of contagion, no shared food, no common air. Their symptoms mimicked exhaustion at first, shallow breath, flinching light sensitivity, a sudden resistance to touch, and then finally, an unshakable dread of being watched even in empty rooms. The locals called it the twilight dread. But when he traced the path of those afflicted, all routes turned back toward the convent, not directly, not openly. But every girl had touched something from within those stone walls. A cloth bandage gifted during a charitable visit, a vial of holy water shared during Mass, a charm tied with convent ribbon. And always the same detail whispered by their mothers in the quietest corners of their homes. None of the girls could sleep through the sound of bells that no one else heard. The church wanted silence. Dr. Thorne wanted answers. The convent greeted him with smiles, stiff and rehearsed. He was granted a half-day to inspect the halls under the pretense of checking water rot and the spread of damp mold. But what he found was dry. Too dry. The air in the main wing felt mummified, as if it had never known moisture. But it wasn't until he walked past the third hallway, the one marked only by a dark wooden arch, that he felt something deeper. The passage was sealed by 3 iron latches, bolted into stone, but those weren't what stopped him. It was the carvings, not Latin, not Christian. Something older. Symbols gouged into the wood with bone or claw, loops intersecting with teeth, lines that spiraled into each other with no center. He had studied enough field medicine in West Africa during his years as a military surgeon to know exactly what they were. Ritual binding sigils, used not to bless but to bind, not to keep evil out, but to keep something in. He asked the Mother Superior about the passage. She smiled, told him the wing had been closed since the flood of 1826, that the walls were unstable, that the air carried black mold. He nodded, feigned belief. But that night he returned with a lantern and a crowbar. The locks gave with effort, rust shrieking as they peeled away from the hinges. The door did not open so much as breathe, exhaling cold, fetid air that reeked of decay and old flowers. Inside, the walls were covered in wax. Not candle wax, skin wax, the kind made by boiling fat and blood. Dozens of childlike figures were painted onto the surface in that wax, hands outstretched, mouths wide open but not in joy, in frozen screaming. The corridor led to a room with no door, only a curtain made of braided hair. Long strands twisted together so tightly they crunched when touched. Beyond it, the room was circular, with an altar in the center made of salt blocks and bone mortar. Around it were 7 chairs, all facing inward, their cushions blackened and crusted. Each chair had a small wooden box beneath it, no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside the boxes were teeth, hundreds, sorted by size, shape, age, some gold-capped, some cracked, all arranged with disturbing precision. The far wall bore a phrase carved in French. Ceux qui dorment nourrissent celui qui attend. Those who sleep feed the one who waits. As he turned to leave, he saw the mark again, the same ritual binding symbol, only this time carved into the back of his own lantern, not by his hand. Not by accident. He hadn't noticed it when he brought it in. Something had already marked him. The fever spread faster after that. Not in town, in him. He began losing track of hours. His fingers trembled when idle. He stopped sleeping. When he finally collapsed in his office, sweating and shaking, they found pages of notes he'd written without memory. Drawings of the symbols, detailed diagrams of bones, and lists of names he had no reason to know. Names of the dead, names of the missing. Names of girls no older than 14 whose parents had once written to the convent requesting sanctuary. Not one letter had ever received a reply. But inside the locked wing he had seen dozens of beds, all child-sized. He had seen dolls with needles through their eyes. And in one corner beneath a sheet he had found a small iron box. Inside was a jawbone, still bloody, with a rosary threaded through the molars like wire. The Mother Superior claimed ignorance. Said he must have fallen, hit his head. Said there was no locked wing. Said he had imagined it. And then she smiled, not kindly, but as though she were waiting for him to admit that he already knew too much. Dr. Thorne left the next day. He never returned to the town. But 3 months later, his body was found floating face up in the Mississippi, eyes wide open, teeth removed. His death was ruled suicide, but those who examined his corpse found something that did not make the reports. Beneath his tongue was a sliver of wax carved with a single word in French: veille, watch, or stay awake. And so the locked wing was sealed again, but not with metal. This time they used silence. No one spoke of it. No one mentioned its corridor in blueprints. But at night, when the wind hit the back of the convent, a faint scraping could be heard behind the wall. The sound of chairs dragging in a circle, one after another, waiting to be filled. The choir once echoed through the bayou like breath through bone, soft, steady, full of warmth. The girls at Rose of Mercy had been known for their voices, for their harmonies that drifted across the swamp like incense. Mothers from nearby towns sent their daughters not for salvation but for song, believing that within those stone walls their children would learn music and manners, not madness. But that music had vanished. The last time the choir sang, something broke. It wasn't a note or a voice. It was the air itself. A sound had slipped through low and wrong, a pitch that didn't belong in any human scale. One girl fell to the floor, clawing at her own ears. Another fainted. A third whispered afterward that the song had said her name, not in words, but in feeling, the way dread sometimes calls you before it arrives. That was the night the choir was silenced, not scolded, silenced. By dawn, the girls had been taken to the infirmary one by one, no explanation given, no injury reported, just a new rule. The choir would now practice in silence. Not a metaphorical silence, but a complete and brutal one. The practice began with wool gags soaked in blessed vinegar to cleanse the mouth of disobedient vibrations. But when the girls continued to hum in their sleep, the sisters escalated. Horsehair, coarse, black, and twisted, was stitched crudely through the tips of their tongues, looped and tied, then burned with ash from the chapel's altar coals. The pain was not just physical, it was spiritual, or so they were told. To cry out was to feed the thing they were trying to contain. To scream was to wake it. The girls were not punished for suffering. They were punished for making sound. The ritual had roots in 17th century France, when heretic children were silenced to prevent their blasphemous dreams from infecting the holy. At Rose of Mercy it was revived not to protect doctrine, but to protect something hidden deep beneath the floorboards. One of the youngest girls, Mireille, only 9 years old, was found trying to write her dreams down with a nail on the underside of her bed frame. When the Mother Superior discovered her, she did not strike her. She removed the child's teeth carefully, one by one, while whispering prayers in a language no one else spoke. The teeth were placed in a velvet pouch and buried beneath the bell tower. The next night the bell rang even though the rope had been severed a month before. The stitching became mandatory after that, no longer an act of punishment but of protection. The threads were tightened weekly. Any loosened loop was considered an invitation. A few girls tried to communicate through blinking, through scratching letters into dirt with their toes. One was caught drawing music notes on her thigh with ash. She was locked in the cold cellar, surrounded by jars filled with preserved vocal cords floating in vinegar. When they retrieved her, her eyes had gone gray, not blind, just emptied. The trauma did not stay contained. The girls' mothers, those who had not fled, began to receive packages from the convent. Not letters, not drawings. Tongues, small and pale, each tied in silk and branded with the convent's seal. It was never confirmed whether they were human. But no mother ever came to collect her daughter afterward. The fear was not just grief. It was guilt, as if somewhere deep inside they knew they had traded their children's voices for safety, had ignored the signs for too long. One priest tried to intervene, sent by the diocese to investigate. He was allowed in, but never made it out. His body was later found floating in a canal, mouth sewn shut with the same horsehair thread, throat filled with salt. A single line was scratched into his chest. She heard him speak. What disturbed even the older sisters was that the girls, after a while, stopped resisting. They began to smile through their silence. They moved in perfect synchronicity. They would sit in the chapel for hours, heads tilted slightly, as if listening to a melody no one else could hear. Some claimed their veins pulsed in rhythm, that you could hear their hearts beating the same pattern if you pressed your ear to their own chests. And sometimes when lightning struck nearby, the girls would all look toward the altar at once, not in terror but in expectation. It was as if they were waiting for something, or worse, already preparing for it. The Mother Superior spoke often now of a song beneath the world, a frequency that only the innocent could feel. She believed the choir had tapped into it accidentally, that their harmonies had crossed a boundary not meant to be crossed. She called it the inheritance of sound, a gift passed down by blood, not training, a sound not made by lungs or tongues but by the soul itself trying to return to its origin. But origin meant the beginning, and the beginning was never empty. It was filled with screams. To stop the song from growing, she devised one final act. Each choir girl was to have her ears packed with wax and crushed rose thorns, melted and molded into place, a seal against the echoes of her own voice. Several became infected, one went blind. Another began convulsing in the night, lips moving without sound. She was found dead by morning, eyes open, hands clenched around her own throat. No one removed her. Her body was left at the foot of the altar for 7 days as a reminder. Her presence was referred to as the still note. When they finally buried her, it was said her mouth had bloomed open beneath the soil. No worms touched her. The ground hardened like bone. The choir no longer moved through the halls. They became part of the chapel itself, still silent, kneeling in perfect rows, their stitched tongues blackening slowly over time. Yet the sound returned, not music, a vibration, beneath the floor, in the walls, in the lungs of those who dared listen too long. And so the stitching continued, and the silence once imposed became worship, because to make a sound now was not to express, it was to summon. At first it was believed to be a miracle, a strange one, yes. But in the backwater parishes of Louisiana, where the line between holy and haunting was always thin, the faithful learned not to question what bled in the shape of the cross. The infants brought to Rose of Mercy for baptism began leaving not just with water on their foreheads, but with a mark between their shoulder blades. 2 raised welts, blistered, always precise, always symmetrical. The mark looked seared into the skin as though by heated iron, but no burns were witnessed. The ritual took place behind the chapel curtain. The child was handed over. A prayer was whispered. The candle was snuffed. When the child was returned, the mark was already blooming red through the white christening gown. The mothers were told it was a divine sign, the kiss of sanctity, the holy seal of the watcher who sees without sleep. That phrase wasn't in any scripture, but the sisters recited it like doctrine. Over time, the townspeople began to call the brand the cross that wept, because the blister would leak a clear, tear-like fluid for days, as if the child was mourning something no one could name. But morning came soon enough. The babies changed after baptism. Some stopped crying entirely. Others cried for hours with no pause. A few began to stare at walls or corners, reaching for things that weren't there. And more than one mother swore her child began to hum in its sleep. Not lullabies, but dissonant melodies that didn't follow any rhythm known to the ear. The church dismissed these claims as superstition, the paranoia of new mothers under strain. But the mothers were not imagining the heat. Every one of them reported that their babies' backs remained hot to the touch, sometimes even steaming through their blankets. One woman pressed her ear to her daughter's spine and swore she heard whispers, not from the baby but from within the flesh, like something was speaking through the scar. The priest called it blasphemy. The convent called it spiritual resonance, but no one would explain why the candle used in baptism was replaced after every child, or why the font was kept under lock and key, or why the oil smelled of sulfur. Then came the night one mother returned. Her name was Sabine Durand, a widow from a rice-farming village west of the bayou. She had brought her infant son Laurent to be baptized after her neighbors convinced her it was the only way to ward off the fever that had taken 3 children in her lane. The sisters accepted him with gentle hands. Sabine watched the candle flicker, heard the chanting. When her son was returned, he was silent, eyes open, unblinking. She thanked the sisters and left. But that night something gnawed at her. Her son would not nurse, would not cry, would not sleep. He stared at the ceiling all night, lips twitching like he was mouthing silent prayers. And beneath his cotton nightshirt, the skin blistered hotter by the hour. By morning her hands were covered in fluid and blood. She wrapped the child and walked back through the storm. But she did not knock. She waited until nightfall. She climbed over the convent wall under moonlight and slipped in through the coal cellar. What she found shattered her. In the chapel, the font had been moved, not beneath the crucifix, but deep into the basement below, a room carved into the ground like a wound. There a table of iron and leather straps stood beneath a pipe-fed cistern, not of holy water but of scalding mineral brine. Next to it a brazier glowed with coals, and floating above them, suspended by wire, were a dozen tiny iron brands, each one shaped like a cross, each one no larger than a baby's palm. On the far wall, shelves lined with ceramic bowls held a thick yellowing paste, lye mixed with lamb fat and grave salt. This was not baptism, this was scar-making, ritual burning. The infants were being marked like livestock, tagged not for heaven but for something else, something waiting. Before she could run, Sabine saw the ledger. A thick book bound in human hide, tucked beneath the altar. Inside were the names of every child baptized, followed by a column of dates, measurements, blood type, and an eerie final note marked in red ink beside each entry. Receiver. Awaiting placement. It was a catalog, a collection of data, not for faith, for feeding, for preparation. Some children had second entries marked years later. Removed, failed assimilation. One had a single word written across the page, empty. Sabine fled, son in arms, silent scream locked in her throat. But something followed her home. The mark on Laurent's back deepened by the hour. His skin began to flake. His limbs trembled without reason. By the third night he began to speak, not words, but guttural sounds, echoing phrases Sabine remembered hearing from the basement. She begged her priest for help. He told her she was cursed, that she should drown the child before the next bell. But she didn't. She stayed. And one morning she was found on her knees beside the cradle, eyes wide, hair torn out in clumps, tongue missing. She had bitten it off. Laurent was gone. The mark on the mattress burned through the wood. All that remained was the sound, low and constant, of the child's breath still echoing in the room despite the cradle being empty. When the authorities searched the convent again, the baptismal records were gone. The basement sealed. The Mother Superior claimed there had never been a Sabine Durand. No such child named Laurent. No infants baptized that season. But in the chapel, the baptismal candle continued to flicker, and its flame burned blue. The book was never meant to be found, not by those who breathed free air. Bound in stitched lambskin and sealed with wax dyed the color of night bruises, the ledger sat hidden in a hollow beneath the stone altar, wedged so tightly it groaned when pulled loose. The pages had no numbers, no chapters, only names, hundreds of names, and all of them written in a thick, grainy script that shimmered faintly blue. The ink was not ink. It was ground salt, once used in colonial preservation rites to keep the body from rotting during long voyages, mixed with mineral dye and marrow. Each letter glittered like bone dust. Each page smelled faintly of dried flowers and rot. It was Mother Clarisse's hand that had recorded them, neat, precise, deeply controlled. Every name belonged to a child. Some had dates beside them, others had symbols, and some had no age, no time, just the name. As if they were being documented not because they had lived, but because someone insisted they should have. The title at the front read Livre de Purification, the Book of Cleansing. But there was no purity here, only evidence. Each name was followed by a ritual description, short and horrifying in its bluntness, salted through the mouth, bled at the spine, eyes removed before confession. Some bore the word failed, others silent, and a few were crossed out entirely. Not in ink, but carved through the page so hard that the marks had bled into the next. These were not children the world had forgotten. These were children it had never been allowed to know. Many bore the surnames of local families, mothers who believed their infants had been stillborn or who had miscarried without explanation. But the dates beside those names told another story. Weeks, sometimes months after the death was declared, which meant the children had not died in the womb. They had been taken, held, and then used. Used for what was a question only the ledger dared answer, in the margins in small ritualistic notations. Third attempt at host merging, no vocal retention. Heart continues to beat for 19 minutes post-removal. The precision was surgical, almost scientific, but buried in language stolen from religion. Clarice had turned the convent into a chamber of study. Not for theology, but for threshold manipulation. She was trying to engineer something. Not resurrection, but re-entry. A way to invite something into the world without letting it break the body it entered. The infants were vessels. Their silence was not their own. It had been arranged. And the salt, the blue salt, was central to it all. Historically, blue salt had been used in the colonies to dry and preserve cadavers before they could be buried or shipped. But in the convent it had a different purpose. It was laced into the feeding cloths of the infants, burned into the air vents, rubbed on the gums of toddlers under the guise of pain relief. In large amounts it caused paralysis, hallucinations, temperature drops. And it preserved not just the body but something deeper, something that lingered in the cells. It allowed what was inside to remain inside, or more accurately, what was being put inside to stay long enough to grow. Every name in the book was a record of an experiment, and Clarice did not see herself as a killer. She saw herself as a midwife of a new order. Her notes grew more erratic with time. Early pages were orderly. Late entries were fragmented, fevered. She began referring to the infants not as children but as candidates. Later as receivers. Finally as mouthing bones. That phrase repeated over and over. Now the mouthing bones are closest to speech. Whatever was trying to come through needed a voice, but human throats broke when it tried, so she adjusted. She tried removing the tongue before infusion. She tried lacing milk with blessed vinegar and ground nails. She wrote about a sound the children made just before death. Not crying, not gasping, but a wet clicking like teeth grinding from inside the stomach. That was the sound she wanted. That was the sound she believed would open the final gate. The psychological toll on Clarice was not madness. It was something worse, clarity without morality. She believed she was being instructed that her work was not invention but transcription. And as her mind unraveled, her language became more symbolic. She replaced words with glyphs. Circles with spines, triangles with holes carved through them. One page listed a single sentence. This one kept singing after the lungs collapsed. There was no name, no date, only a dark blue thumbprint beside it, small as a newborn's. Another page had been scratched over entirely, but when held to light revealed the faint outline of a body sketched in blood. Measurements surrounded it, not of height or weight, but of silence. Seconds, minutes, hours. How long the host can endure without sound before bursting. At the very end of the book was a folded page stained darker than the rest. It wasn't inked, it was stitched, tiny black thread forming a shape like a throat with no tongue. Below it a single name was written in gold salt. Ephraim. No date, no details. But surrounding that name were dozens of smaller names written in spirals like satellites around a dying sun. Some of these had been scratched out. Others were duplicated. That name, Ephraim, appeared again on the wall of the locked wing, again in the baptismal basin, etched into the stone, again in the corner of the choir's hymn book carved through the leather spine. Whoever or whatever Ephraim was, it had already been placed in more than one child, and each attempt had failed, until now. The Book of Blue Salt was not destroyed. It was sealed again, entombed in wax and bone, and hidden deeper within the convent's foundation. But its pages had already bled into the walls, into the prayers, into the silence. The sisters didn't need to read it anymore. They had memorized the sound of the salt grinding beneath their fingernails. They knew the names by breath, and when the bell rang again, it rang not to summon the faithful, but to signal the next entry, the next child, the next vessel, the next experiment. The rain came without pause that week, hammering against the stone walls of Rose of Mercy as though the sky itself was trying to wash the place away. The river swelled, the soil turned to sludge, and the chapel's wooden floor, warped and weakened over decades of neglect and silence, finally gave under the weight of something it could no longer hold. It wasn't loud, just a low groan, a splintering breath, followed by the soft thud of something hollow striking dirt. When the sisters entered the chapel the next morning, they found the pews shifted slightly, as if someone had risen mid-sermon and walked away. And there, near the altar, one of the floorboards had split apart, revealing a cavity just large enough for one human body. What they saw inside was not a corpse. It was a confession. The mummified figure lay curled like a child hiding from light. Her habit, long since faded to brittle threads, was still recognizably stitched in the Rose of Mercy pattern. Pale blue crosses along the hem, meant to resemble drops of heaven. But her face was what arrested them, torn open, not by decay but by force. Skin split from jaw to ear as if she'd tried to scream, and her body refused to let the sound escape cleanly. Her lips had been sutured with rosary beads, each one shoved into her mouth and down her throat until the chain coiled like a snake of glass and gilt inside her windpipe. Her cheeks bore symmetrical carvings, thin and sharp, etched with something finer than a blade. Dried channels of blood and salt, meticulously shaped into tear tracks. Not from pain, but to mimic weeping. Someone had made her into a statue of suffering, and someone had taken their time. She was not listed in the convent's death records, not in the burial register, not in the chapel scrolls. No one claimed to remember her name. But in the ledger of penances, long since buried beneath layers of falsified scripture, a notation appeared beside an entry simply marked January 8th, year of restraint. The note read, "Silenced after breach." Mouth returned to prayer. It was not signed, but the ink was the same used by Mother Clarice in the Book of Blue Salt. The pattern was clear. The execution wasn't random. It was a message, not to others, but to the body itself. A ritual of erasure, meant to extinguish rebellion not by punishment, but by transformation. This nun had broken protocol. She had tried to speak, and instead of execution, she was preserved beneath the altar like a cursed relic. A warning carved into flesh, designed to watch every sermon from beneath the floorboards, eternally silent. The floodwater began to seep into the cavity, soaking the robe, dislodging one of the rosary beads from her teeth. It rolled out onto the chapel floor and came to rest beneath the feet of Sister Eloise, who had been only 9 years old when she first heard what she thought were footsteps below the pulpit. Now older, she bent to retrieve the bead and found her hands trembling, her breath catching before it could become sound. In that moment she remembered, not a name, but a voice. A lullaby once sung during early vigil, a voice that had vanished suddenly one spring. They had been told the singer had transferred to another parish, but no such transfer had ever been recorded. After the discovery, the chapel was closed for 3 days. The floor was hastily repaired. The body, they claimed, had been exhumed from a forgotten grave beneath the structure, a mislaid relic from an earlier generation. But the sisters who cleaned the cavity knew better. They found scratch marks along the inner beams, fingernail remnants embedded in the support timber. And worst of all, they found the final bead lodged deep in the throat, fused to a string of papery folded skin, as if the esophagus itself had tried to spit it back. They left that one in place, out of fear, out of reverence, out of something closer to guilt. It wasn't the only body. Days later, another floorboard shifted in the north hallway, revealing a wrapped bundle of bones tied with rosary knots and swaddled in choir linens. The skull was fractured in the shape of a crucifix. No jaw, no teeth. A nun who had vanished mid-year, remembered only in the margins of a hymn book with the word empty scribbled beside her part. The discovery unraveled the illusion of sacredness that the sisters had maintained for decades. They began to speak less, walk slower, avoid eye contact with the floor. The wooden panels no longer seemed firm. They felt like the thinnest skin stretched over a festering mouth. And when it rained, the chapel echoed not with thunder, but with the imagined whisper of bones shifting below. Mother Clarice offered no explanation. She forbade discussion of the event. The chapel reopened with new paint, brighter candles, and louder sermons. But the eyes of the sisters wandered. They looked down. They listened more. Because the silence under their feet had changed, it was no longer passive. It pulsed. And those who knelt on the altar too long swore they could hear her breathing, not with lungs, but through the cracks in the wood. The sound of air moving through rosary beads like wind through broken teeth. The final entry in the convent's private journal, kept in Clarisse's own hand, simply read, "She tried to carry the voice. It broke her open. Now she guards it instead." And beneath that, one more line scratched in a different hand, shaky and rough, as if written in the dark. "It's not her we buried. It's what she swallowed." The letters were found sealed behind the broken tile of a confessional wall, each one folded with clinical care and bound with a thread of human hair. There were 73 in total, dated between 1808 and 1814, all signed in the distinct hand of Father Armand Benoit, the founder of Rose of Mercy Convent, once revered for his teachings on discipline and divine silence. What they revealed was not theology, but experimentation. His words were not prayers. They were formulas, instructions. The outline of a method that would later be known only in whispers as the experiment of Saint Restraint. Father Benoit did not believe in sin. He believed in defects. Specifically in women. He saw free will not as a divine gift, but as a flaw that needed removal. In his mind, obedience wasn't holiness. It was purity. and purity could be manufactured if the right balance of chemical and spiritual control was applied at birth, or sooner. The early letters described trials done on orphaned girls brought from New Orleans, never recorded, never baptized, stripped of name and identity. Father Benoit believed that pain could shape the soul, but it had to be precise. Crude violence only broke the body. But soft, rhythmic torture, the kind that lingered just below the threshold of death, could train the mind to associate stillness with survival. The first phase involved isolation and sleeplessness. The girls were locked in pitch-black chambers for 90 hours, only to be woken every time their breath deepened into rest. A bell would ring, a light would flash, a sudden burst of cold water. After 8 days, only 3 out of 11 could still walk. The others shook uncontrollably, having lost their sense of time, direction, and language. But Benoit noted it as a success. They no longer asked questions. The second phase was chemical. The formula changed often, but the base remained the same. A compound of belladonna root for neural dulling, lye to cause internal tremors, and liquefied rabbit brain harvested at dusk. The rabbit, he wrote, was chosen for its lack of rebellion when handled, a trait he believed could be absorbed if prepared correctly. The mixture was heated, blessed, and injected directly into the base of the spine while the girls were still conscious. It burned for 30 seconds. Most screamed. One girl vomited blood until her eyes turned inward, and she spoke in Latin, though she had never been taught. Benoit documented the event as a glimpse into pre-sin cognition. She died 20 minutes later, lungs full of fluid and throat scratched raw from the inside. Her body was kept in the chapel freezer for 3 weeks. He wanted to see if the chemical's effects lingered after death. They did. Her muscles continued twitching each time a psalm was read aloud nearby. By the 4th phase, the survivors had no names, no memory of outside life, and no language beyond echoing the last words spoken to them. They were led into chambers painted entirely white, no windows, no corners, no shadows, where they were told to kneel until they could no longer feel their own bodies. Food was administered through liquefied paste scented with rosewater and salt to keep their digestive systems calm. Sleep was outlawed. They were chained by their wrists not for punishment but to keep their spines arched. The arch, Benoit believed, kept the chemical active, allowing it to seep into the nervous system like prayer into the soul. If a girl collapsed, she was beaten with willow branches soaked in vinegar and wrapped in scripture pages. Verses from Romans and Revelations, chosen not for meaning, but for the frequency of the word obedience. One entry noted the appearance of a shadow inside the room during the 35th trial. A figure described as headless, humming, with arms held out as if cradling something missing. Several girls screamed upon seeing it. 2 died within minutes. Benoit concluded that their spiritual resistance had cracked open a channel into something older than Scripture, something that responded to their pain not with mercy but with mimicry. He called it the echoing one. And from that point on, the experiment was no longer about discipline. It became communion. He began branding the girls with the seal of Saint Restraint, a symbol made of 3 overlapping mouths with no eyes carved with iron needles into their palms. He claimed it marked them as vessels for silent divinity. But the girls did not live long. Their bodies aged rapidly, their teeth fell out. Their skin became translucent. Some began to repeat the same phrase in reverse. He waits through the quiet. One dug out her own eyes. Another bit off her fingers one by one and stacked them like communion wafers. When Benoit was finally reported missing, it wasn't by the church. It was by the man who delivered ink and wax to the convent, who found the ledger of chemical orders and noticed that shipments had doubled without any recorded baptisms. The search uncovered the white chamber beneath the east wing. The floor was stained with blue salt and blood. The walls were cracked from pressure inside. Of the final 6 girls kept there, only one was alive, sitting perfectly still in a kneeling position, eyes closed, breathing so shallow she seemed embalmed. She didn't react to light or sound, but when touched she whispered one word. Again. Her tongue had been removed and replaced with a thin strip of leather sewn to her jaw. A rosary bead hung from each stitch like teeth. She died 2 days later, her heart slowing until it simply forgot to beat. The autopsy revealed her brain had shrunk to half its size, but her pineal gland, the part some called the soul's seat, was swollen, glowing faintly under violet light. The letters were sealed in the church's vaults. The experiment was never officially acknowledged, but the name Saint Restraint lived on in whispered curses, in the corners of nursing homes where older sisters refused to sleep with the lights off, and deep in the foundation of the convent, behind the bricked-up chamber walls. The phrase, "He waits through the quiet," was still carved over and over in cracked stone, in hands too small to hold a pen. The well had been dry for years. At least, that's what the sisters claimed. Its stone lip, cracked and overgrown with moss, stood crooked behind the convent's north wall like a forgotten relic from some earlier prayer. Something left behind by a generation that no longer dared to speak its name. But the truth was it had never dried. Not really. Its waters had only sunk deeper, darker, pulling into a hidden pit so far beneath the earth that even sound had trouble returning. When the flooding came and loosened the mud, the soil pulled back just enough to expose the well's bottom. And with it, the spiral. Workers draining the grounds discovered it first. They dropped a bucket expecting silt and dead leaves. Instead, the rope returned damp with brine and hair. And beneath the weight of stagnant water, something far heavier waited. The well's floor was lined not with stone, but with flesh. Dozens of small bodies curled into one another, each one no larger than a hand. Fetal remains preserved so completely they looked as though they had fallen asleep together in silence. But their placement defied accident. They had been arranged in a perfect spiral. Heads inward, limbs outward, ribs stacked in rhythmic intervals. It was not burial, it was music. A score written in bone, a geometry of sacrifice. Each fetus bore the remnants of a procedure, the chest opened cleanly, the throat hollowed with surgical precision. Not a tear, not a drop of blood, just the absence of sound where sound should have been born. Their mouths were sealed with wax, their ears packed with blue salt, their eyes removed entirely and replaced with smoothed beads of black stone. All identical, all placed as though to listen for something no living thing should ever hear. Along the rim of the chamber, shelves carved directly into the stone held dozens of small glass jars. Inside each floated a strip of curled pink tissue, vocal cords labeled in the same crooked hand found in the Book of Blue Salt. Every jar bore a date, Every label carried the same phrase: to keep the night quiet. Some dates matched baptismal records. Others corresponded with reported miscarriages from nearby villages. But a few had no record at all. No mother, no mention, as if the child had been born only to be taken, silenced, and folded into the well like a note passed to something sleeping beneath it. One jar was still warm to the touch, its wax seal fresh. The sisters claimed it was a relic, a holy remnant of early martyrdom. But those who touched it heard a hum, not from the jar, but from within themselves, low and pulsing, like a sound trying to find its way back into the world through the throat of someone not yet dead. Mother Clarice had written about the well in her final journal entries. She described it not as a place, but as an instrument. She believed the spiral of remains was more than symbolic, that it created a shape the soul could feel, that by arranging the unborn this way they could form a resonance chamber for divine frequency, a choir without mouths, a hymn without breath. She called it the root of silence, a place where God could whisper through bodies that had never sinned, that had never spoken, that had never disobeyed. But her notes also revealed panic. She wrote of something responding not in words but in events. Thunder that cracked with no storm, fires that started in salt-locked rooms. A voice heard behind her eyelids repeating the names she had etched into the spiral. Not in accusation, but in hunger. She feared it wasn't God that answered. The psychology of the act was not religious, it was possessive. These children, many conceived in secrecy or stolen at birth, were not merely victims. They were curated, selected for their silence, for the clean slate of their minds. To Clarice, their voicelessness was not a flaw, it was purity. She believed that sound corrupted, that the moment a child cried, it began to decay. So she kept them quiet forever. She fed them chemicals while in the womb. Bitter oils and ash extracts slipped into their mother's communion wine to ensure underdeveloped lungs, limp cords, docile hearts. Those that didn't miscarry were delivered into hidden chambers, strangled before their first breath and prepared for the spiral. Their vocal cords were harvested still warm. Their wax-sealed lips were carved into slight smiles, not for comfort, but for containment. A smile holds tension. A scream does not. When the well was finally drained, the bodies were removed in silence. No autopsy, no mass grave. The church arrived within 24 hours and declared the entire area sacred, barring excavation under threat of excommunication. A priest who attempted to document the discovery died 3 days later in his sleep, his mouth filled with hardened wax and a string of rosary beads forced between his clenched teeth, identical to the nun beneath the chapel floorboards. The official cause was asphyxiation. The sisters wept, not for him, but because they believed the well had opened too soon. They sealed it again, this time with concrete and iron etched with the same symbol of Saint Restraint, 3 mouths closed by thorns. But something had changed. The spiral had been disturbed. The bodies had been handled. The jars had been moved. And at night the sisters swore they could hear a new sound rising from beneath the foundation. Not crying, not whispering, singing, but not in harmony. Each voice slightly off from the other, like a melody stitched from broken ribs. The notes did not follow one another. They piled, they folded, they waited. And beneath every step, the floor now echoed just a little too long, as though something down there had started breathing. The fire began in the east wing, not with lightning, not with candles, but with wind that blew from the inside out. It did not rage like ordinary flames. It crawled, slow and choking, curling black fingers beneath the floorboards and between the ribs of the walls as if it were searching for something left unfinished. Smoke rose not in plumes but in coils, spiraling skyward like incense. The sisters ran silently, no screams, no prayer. Those who made it out watched without expression as the windows melted and the roof folded in on itself. And then, at the exact moment the altar caved into ash, the bell rang. Just once. The sound cracked through the sky like a breath held too long. And though the ropes had been cut years earlier, the iron swung visibly, slowly, as if moved by something with a memory. The convent was sealed by decree 2 days later. No one argued. No one entered. Officials brought limestone chains and concrete. They didn't record what they saw when they cleared the ruin. They didn't report what they found in the choir pit. The rows of kneeling sisters turned to charcoal, still in prayer, still upright. They did not speak of the bones in the well, freshly disturbed and arranged in a new pattern. No longer a spiral, but a perfect silent circle. They did not mention the book pulled from the ashes of Mother Clarice's room, its cover burned away but its pages intact, the final one blank except for a phrase etched in blood. I kept it sleeping as long as I could. In the years that followed, survivors were quietly relocated. The youngest were sent to rural homes, their names changed, their tongues still stitched. The older ones, those too scarred or too unstable to rejoin the world, were buried in state-run hospitals under diagnoses that meant nothing. Spiritual mania, feral melancholy, auditory delusion. Most died without ever speaking again, but some began to write. Shaky letters, drawings, repeating symbols traced into walls or carved into furniture. The closed-mouth icon of Saint Restraint. It appeared on blankets, in school books, in soil outside garden beds. And when questioned, the girls only blinked, or hummed, or rocked back and forth until sedated. A federal commission was formed to investigate not just Rose of Mercy, but all institutions like it, places where prayer had become a mask for pain. What they uncovered was not just a single evil, but a system of belief so old and so deeply buried that it had been mistaken for holiness. Testimonies revealed patterns of calculated silence, of chemical sleep used to erase resistance, of branding passed off as baptism, of internal punishments meant to separate body from self, the practice of moral anesthesia, sedating the conscience rather than the nerves, was traced to over 28 institutions across 4 southern states. Most had no official records, but some had names carved into cell walls, names that matched those in the Book of Blue Salt. The commission's findings were declared too inflammatory for the public. The archives were sealed. But change came quietly. Laws were passed banning chemical restraint in religious institutions. Faith-run asylums were placed under state surveillance. A term entered legal vocabulary that had never existed before: psychospiritual mutilation. In 1891, after nearly 50 years of silence, one survivor, Sister Camille, age 71, broke her vow in a courtroom. Her voice shook, her body trembled, but her words were clear. She described the choir of infants, the stitched mouths, the taste of vinegar and lye in the communion bread. She named Clarice. She named Benoit. She told them what they made her do to the girls who woke up screaming. She told them about the dreams, how they still came, always the same. The bell ringing without cause, the sound splitting her in half. When she finished, she collapsed. Her lungs hemorrhaged on the stand. She died that night in her cell, and her final breath smelled faintly of salt. The memorial was built in 1903 on what remained of the convent's southern garden, a place once used to grow herbs for sedatives. No crosses were allowed, no statues, just a low stone wall surrounding a pit of melted rosaries. Hundreds of beads fused together by fire formed a black mass with no shape. A plaque reads only, "For those made to kneel without cause." The wall weeps when it rains. Locals say the beads shift when no one's watching. And once a year, without warning, the bell rings. Still once, still without a rope, but the phrase survived. Saint Restraint became a whisper in southern towns, a warning told to children who fidgeted during Mass, to girls who asked too many questions. It came to mean something bigger, something that couldn't be named without trembling. It meant obedience without understanding, discipline without mercy, faith without freedom. And though the convent is gone, its methods remain in shadows, in how the world treats silence as sainthood, how institutions still hide cruelty beneath paper and cloth, how suffering is still called holy when the right face delivers it. Evil, when cloaked in faith, does not shout, it does not wear horns or drip blood, it kneels, it folds hands, it smiles, it writes its rules in the margins of sacred books and waits for no one to notice what's missing. It prays not to be forgiven, but to be mistaken for good. And once it teaches others to do the same, it does not need to survive in buildings or names. It survives in the silence that follows. So now we ask, what do you think? Could it happen again if we let silence return?